Shall we start then? I think we have enough quorum. Indrani, we'll start. Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Ujjwal Bhatia. I think it's really nice. We were just asking Indrani before we started at tea that what is the normal, attendance for these kind of conferences and seminars. So she was saying it varies between 5 and 50. So I think going by that yardstick, we clearly are, the Doha round is clearly not dead because there is so much interest. It's certainly much more than 5, even if not 50. And hopefully as the time goes on, we will find more and more people joining us because I think they all know that.
Also point to good friendship.
No. I don't think it's so purely friendship because Mr. Bhatia really has made a name for himself when he was in Geneva. I think, if at all India was looked at with some respect, because very often we are told that we send people who are not sufficiently prepared, we send people who just go there to have a good time, and that India has always been criticized for that. I think that was one criticism we didn't hear when he was there to look after India's interests in the WTO. Unfortunately for him, I think that was a time, unfortunately I say use the word unfortunately in two ways, because that was the time when WTO was really active and there was so much talk about Doha that I don't think he got much time to rest. Whereas today I think our present representative there is having an easy time because Doha is, not dead as yet, but all but. So I think here's Mr. Bhatia. He'll tell you whether he thinks, is it dead? Is it comatose? Can it be brought to life? What is the status? And I asked him before we started whether he's open to questions during the talk, which is more interesting for the audience, but less, not so interesting for the speaker because it tends to distract him, or whether he wants questions only at the end. But he was nice enough to say that he's completely open to questions anytime during his presentation. So he has a PowerPoint presentation, and anytime you feel that you want to kind of quiz him, right there and then, you can. I think. Is that okay, Mr. Bhatia? He's agreed, so I think that's a very nice offer. So you please do cash in on it and don't hesitate to ask him because I think this will be a great learning experience to all of us. Over to you, Mr. Bhatia.
Thank you. Can I speak? Well, thank you, Maithili, for this introduction. And let me begin by foreshadowing my conclusions. That doesn't mean that you can leave after this, but this is what I'm going to say, basically. After nearly a decade, the Doha round started in November 2001, and is going to be 10 years now. We still don't know whether the Doha round can be concluded. And this state of affairs is not because of the complexity of the technical issues involved. It has more to do with the politics of global economic change. And if the Doha round is allowed to fail, I believe that there are serious implications for the world because it would mean that one major pillar of multilateralism, the WTO, will be in crisis. And given the very rapid change that we are seeing in the global economy, with the emergence of new global challenges, you need a robust multilateral process to address these challenges. Since the Second World War, when the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the IBRD, and the GATT were created, the leadership of the multilateral process has been with the winners of the World War, basically the United States and the European Union. But because of the various crises that they are engulfed in, and I will have something more to say about that later, we find that the traditional leaders of the multilateral process are in retreat. And there is a certain power vacuum which is very, very evident in the multilateral process. And now that there is much talk of the emergence of the re-emergence of countries like China, India, and the BRICS, the issue is this gap that exists, the power vacuum that exists to drive the multilateral process, whether it is the WTO, whether it is the climate change negotiations or any other negotiations of an economic kind, whether the emerging economies can fill this breach. And the last point I'll be making is that if India indeed is serious about playing a role, an important role in the global stage, true to its own economic potential, then it has a vast domestic agenda which needs to be addressed, and specifically as far as the economic stage is concerned. It has a number of issues in manufacturing policy, agricultural reforms, innovation, etc., which it needs to address. For instance, in manufacturing policy, today you have a document which the government is deliberating on to increase the contribution of manufacturing from something like 15% of GDP today to something like 25%. Now, is that possible? But for the first time, after many, many years, we find the government actually talking about industrial policy. As you know, there is an international sort of debate going on about whether you need industrial policy at all. There are people like Danny Roderick and all who have been at the forefront of this debate. But now, is it too late? Is it too late to talk about manufacturing policy when China already controls large chunks of the manufacturing space in the world? Agriculture reforms, again, and perhaps I'll say something about these things later. I think the need for agriculture reforms in India is self-evident. For the last 60 years in the international negotiations in GATT, WTO, we have been making basically this point that India is very poor, that its agriculture is exceedingly low productivity. And in fact, the most commonly quoted statistic in Geneva is 650 million poor Indian farmers. We have been repeating this ad infinitum for a very long time. But the point is this an issue which we need to address domestically, or is it a weakness which we need to keep projecting in the global stage? I'll come to these other issues later, but this is the broad gist of what I'm saying. There are two sort of interlocking themes I'm talking about. One is the complexities involved in the Doha round. What are the issues which are contributing to the impasse? And what is the unfinished work and so on? And the second is the politics of global economic change and what it means for the multilateral process, what it means for emerging countries like India. Now, let me start with the beginning, which is the end of the Second World War, when the GATT was created. And after the end of the war, there was the so-called Bretton Woods Conference, where basically the victors decided to create economic institutions to ensure a proper, orderly global economic governance. And therefore, the IMF was created, the IBRD was created. And there was also the intention to create the ITO, the International Trade Organization. But because of the objections of the US Congress, this was aborted. And eventually the ITO could not be created. And the GATT started as an informal process of negotiations among 23 countries in Geneva. It was always a very provisional affair. There was no intergovernmental agreement which was the platform for the operation of the GATT. It always had what was called a provisional secretariat. But within the almost half a century of its existence, I think the GATT created an amazing architecture for orderly global trade flows. And you may say that the structure, the architecture was designed more for the Western developed countries, but the fact remains that it did create a huge body of work. And specifically the contribution that the GATT made was, firstly, it provided a platform for non-discriminatory trade liberalization. As you know, the major pillar of the GATT system is non-discrimination, which is the most favored nation treatment, which basically means that all members of the GATT have to be treated the same way. You cannot treat one member in a different or a more preferential way. And the other is the so-called national treatment, which basically means that once an entity has entered your borders legally, you cannot discriminate against it. It has to be treated the same way as your own domestic entities are treated. And the second contribution that it had was in creating a corpus of rules to regulate the global trade flows. Rules, for instance, for, say, anti-dumping or rules of origin and so on, which provided, as I said, the architecture, the framework, the underpinnings of the global trading system. But two things I think are important to note here. Till the Uruguay round, which ended in 1994, GATT focused basically on industrial tariffs. It didn't do anything else. It didn't talk about services, didn't talk about intellectual property, and so on. In fact, it did not even talk about agriculture. And it did not talk about agriculture because the majors, the European Union and the Americans, did not want agriculture to be discussed in GATT because of the egregious amount of subsidies that they were providing to their agricultural sector. They didn't want these subsidies to be questioned. Even today, the OECD countries provide something like $360 billion of subsidies to their agriculture sectors every year. Now, the second thing is, I think, even more important in the context of the present impasse that we are witnessing in the Doha round. Most of the trade liberalization which took place during the GATT era, which is basically from 1947 to 1994, took place outside GATT through either unilateral reform, unilateral liberalization like what India does mostly, or through regional trading arrangements. The contribution of GATT was to bring it into the multilateral fold and ask the members of GATT to make multilateral commitments or bindings so that the global system gets a certain predictability. You cannot go back on the bindings once you have made these binding commitments in the GATT. So these, to my mind, were the major contributions that the GATT made in the almost half century of its existence. But let's look at the politics of the management of GATT. The high table was occupied by a very few countries, the United States, the European Union. They decided the GATT agenda, and their contribution, their views were decisive in the sense of molding the outcomes. Major decisions were taken by the Quad: Canada, EU, Japan, and the United States. Let me just give you two instances from the Uruguay round to illustrate this. As I said, for the first time, GATT dealt with agriculture in the Uruguay round because the Americans and the Europeans decided that enough is enough. They were fighting among each other about market access. So they said, okay, let's now bring it to GATT. Let's bind our policies so that nobody can question it later. That's how agriculture entered the GATT system. But the differences between the two continued to such an extent that no agreement was possible in the Uruguay round. Finally, the two of them sat together in the so-called Blair House Agreement in 1992, and they hammered out the agreement on agriculture between the two of them. And that became the agreement on agriculture for the Uruguay round, for the GATT. The developing countries had very, very little role to play in this. And similar was the fate of the negotiations on industrial tariffs. Again, there were a lot of differences among the developed countries themselves. Finally, it was the Quad, these four countries, which got together in 1993 and created the framework of the concessions that would be provided in the Uruguay round. Now, that was the GATT era, 1994. The world changed dramatically. A lot of people have not yet been told about it, and that's why the impasse continues. But the world changed dramatically in the last 15, 16 years of the completion of the Uruguay round. Now, the WTO was created as a part of the Uruguay round, and the WTO inherited not only the GATT legacy, but also much more complexity. For instance, the GATT earlier, before the Uruguay round, as I said, dealt with industrial tariffs alone. But now, because of the Uruguay round, the WTO has many more issues to deal with. It has a much larger membership, and it has to deal with a very different world economy. Now, how did the Uruguay round change the entire scenario of global trade regulation? The Uruguay round brought in services, the General Agreement to Trade in Services. It brought in intellectual property, one of the most controversial things, which remains controversial today, the TRIPS agreement. For the first time, the IPRs were brought into the GATT fold. It brought in agriculture, as I mentioned, the agreement on agriculture. It brought in a very strong dispute settlement mechanism, which is generally regarded as the sort of the crown, the jewel in the crown of the WTO, because it has worked very effectively. And it brought in the system of trade policy reviews. Every country's trade policies are reviewed periodically in the WTO. And that imposes at least some peer pressure on all the members to remain in line. And that is why, for instance, despite the very serious economic crisis that we have witnessed over the last 3 years, there have not been very many egregious protectionist responses because of the kind of pressure that all the members apply on each other. But the most remarkable thing about the Uruguay round was that all the agreements were under the single undertaking. This is the first time the single undertaking was introduced, and basically what it means is that nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. You cannot say, I will pick and choose some agreements out of the total agreements under negotiation. I will implement only a few, not everything. Either you say no to everything, or you have to accept everything. And that was a major departure from the previous GATT practice. Now, how is the WTO different not only from GATT, but from the other Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF, the IBRD? As you know, in the IMF, IBRD, there are quotas in terms of voting shares. The United States, for instance, has more than 16% share, and that amounts to a veto, because you need 85% majority to make fundamental changes in the charter of the IMF and the World Bank. And India's share, for instance, is about 2.5%, 3%, and China's is slightly more, about 4.5%, 5%, and so on. But in the WTO, each country has one vote, and decisions are by consensus. And now it has explicitly an aspiration for universal membership. Presently, there are 153 members, but there are 30 countries in the pipeline, including very strong countries like Russia, for instance, Iran, and some others. The other thing about the WTO is that the results of negotiations are applied on an MFN basis. Even if there is a plurilateral agreement on some specific issue, the other, for instance, the ITA agreement, it was negotiated among a few, but the benefits of that accrue to the entire membership. You cannot say that you are not allowed to join that just because you did not negotiate. So overall, the WTO is generally viewed as a strong body with the ability to monitor adherence because of the strong dispute settlement mechanism that it has. Now, after the Uruguay round, as I said, the world changed. There was an effort to launch a new round in Seattle in 1999, and there was a dramatic failure, in fact, a fiasco. It was a combination of several factors. The Americans wanted to introduce labor standards into trade. The developing countries resisted. The Europeans wanted to introduce the so-called Singapore issues. And the developing countries, countries like India, for instance, they said, we have taken on very many new commitments in the Uruguay round, which concluded just a few years back. Allow us some time to digest them, to implement them. We're not yet ready for a new round. This is for the first time that the developing countries spoke as a body and were able to deny something which the United States and the Europeans wanted. I think this was a watershed moment. Finally, in November 2001, under the special circumstances created by the 9/11 incidents, a new round was launched. But even here, certain compromises had to be made to the developing countries. It was called a development round. The agenda was called a development agenda, and in every paragraph referred to the needs of development, issues of poverty, and so on. But as a major concession, the developing countries agreed to allow the introduction of the Singapore issues into the mandate. Trade and investment issues, competition policy, government procurement, and trade facilitation. But afterwards in Cancun, I think about 2 years later, 2003, because of the resistance of the developing countries, especially the Africans, two of these issues were removed, investment and competition. But arguably, perhaps the most important thing which happened in November 2001 was the accession of China into the WTO. China had been trying for about 16 years to enter the WTO. It made huge concessions. It was really taken to the cleaners in terms of the commitment it was required to make to accede to the WTO. Finally, the Chinese accepted and they were brought into the fold. This was again a very, very similar incident because of the dynamic role that the Chinese have been playing in global economy in the last 2 decades. Now, where does the Doha round stand for the moment? It's about 80% done now, but the rest 20% is very, very complicated. And it is not getting done not because of technical issues involved in the negotiations. It is not getting done because the world has changed. The Americans, for instance, there is a strong lack of appetite in the United States for any new trade agreements. Especially, it always happens when there is a Democrat government. But now, with the crisis, with unemployment at around 9 to 10%, there is a deep aversion to trade deals. And therefore, the US administration is making impossible new demands, which are not mandated in the Doha mandate. And specifically, they are focusing on emerging economies, China, India, Brazil. And they want new market access. Now, what does new market access mean? In the WTO, as I mentioned earlier, what you do is to negotiate on the basis of what you have earlier bound and then say how much more you are going to bind. You're not talking about actual levels of tariffs that exist. You are talking about bound levels of tariffs. Now, for instance, to give you an example, India's average industrial tariffs are something like, bound tariffs are something like 35 to 40%. That's the level which we have agreed to bind in the Uruguay round. Therefore, in the Doha round, we are negotiating down from that level of 35 to 40. Now, in the meantime, however, our average tariffs applied on an applied basis in India are somewhere around 9, 10, 11%. Now, if you apply the formula that we have agreed to, the Swiss formula, our tariffs will actually go down to about 13, 14, 15%. But they will not affect applied tariff levels. What the Americans saying, no, this is not good enough. Your applied tariff on something is 10%, give us something less than that. Make it 7, 8, whatever, but it must be lower than your applied level. This has never been done before. Now, apart from the American demand, there are a number of issues which remain to be negotiated. For instance, agricultural subsidies. As I mentioned, the developed countries provide huge agricultural subsidies to their farmers. Actually, not to the farmers, to their agri-corporations. I remember when Kamal Nath was the trade minister, he had his own style of negotiating. And when we were talking about agricultural subsidies, he would start off by saying, listen, I want to see an American farmer. I've never seen an American farmer. I know about these chaps wearing these Italian suits who come and give me cards and say that they are agri-corporations. But is there an American farmer? So these subsidies are a huge issue for the developing world. In fact, that is how many developing countries got together and created a coalition called the G20, which has been a very effective coalition in the WTO. The special safeguard mechanism, this is an issue which many people blame India for the collapse of the 2008 ministerial meeting. Basically, India is saying, along with another about 50 countries, India is saying that our agriculture is always very threatened. There is a possibility of a surge of imports devastating Indian agriculture. We need a safeguard mechanism to guard against that. And this is an issue which remains unnegotiated. There is the issue of fisheries subsidies, the general theme being that there has been overfishing in the world's oceans, and we now need to discipline the subsidies that are being provided. But again, countries like India have a problem with this, because we have millions of Indian fishermen along the coastline who are very, very poor, and we will certainly not accept any disciplines which constrain our ability to provide assistance to those fishermen. The issue of environment goods, nobody knows what environment goods are actually. There is no definition. For instance, the Japanese and the Koreans would say refrigerators and air conditioners which are non-CFC. They don't use chlorofluorocarbons. They should be environment goods, and so on. So there has never been a definition on environment goods. These negotiations also are incomplete. The issue of dumping, anti-dumping. Now, alone among all the 153 members, the Americans have a practice, I need not go into that, called zeroing in anti-dumping investigations. It has been repeatedly held to be illegal by the appellate body of the WTO, but the Americans will not agree. The so-called issue of Mode 4 access, which is an issue which is very dear to Indians, because what it means is that our skilled IT professionals who go out to execute contracts in the United States or Europe or wherever, they should be given preferential access in terms of visas and so on. But the biggest resistance for this is coming from the United States. And the famous issue of cotton, again, an issue where the Americans are on the defensive because they provide huge amount of subsidies, something like $3 billion of subsidies to their cotton farmers. Only about 25,000 cotton farmers in the United States get about $3 billion of subsidies. There are some very poor countries in Africa who've been urging that these subsidies be eliminated, but the Americans, because of their political compulsions, because of the kind of lobbying that these agri companies do with the US Congress, have not agreed to this. So there are a large number of issues which remain undecided, and a very common denominator here is the American reluctance to agree. Now, as I said, the world has changed. There have been dramatic changes in global competitiveness over the last 2 decades, and the emergence of China as the manufacturing or the assembly hub of the world has changed the whole situation in terms of what competitiveness means. For instance, on the other hand, we have had a number of crises in the developed world in the last decade or so. We started with the dot-com bubble in 2001 in the United States. We have now the continuing saga of the Eurozone crisis. Now the Greece actually there's really a modern Greek tragedy which is unfolding, because the Greeks are in no way going to be able to repay the debt that they have, something like 330 billion euros. But the European Central Bank and the European authorities are maintaining the fiction that it is possible for the Greeks to come out of this without any injury to the Eurozone. I think we have a crisis which will continue with us for a number of years. And then, of course, the financial crisis that we've had in the United States. As a result of all this, there is a certain lack of confidence in America, in the European Union, in their economic future, and that has a bearing on the entire multilateral processes. One very significant change which has taken place is the way things are manufactured in the world. What is an American product, or what is an Indian product? What we have witnessed over the last 10 to 15 years especially is the emergence of global value chains, where now earlier components used to be manufactured in various locations. Now subcomponents are being manufactured in different countries. One very good example of this is the iPod. Now there's a very, very famous study of the iPod, an iPod 30 GB, which used to retail for $299 in the United States market. Now it's an American product, right? Except that it's not made in the United States. Not one component of the iPod is made in the United States. It's made in many countries. It has 451 components. And these 451 components are made in a number of countries, especially in Asian countries. Out of this $299, something like $163 comes to the United States through marketing, royalties, and so on, out of which the Apple Corporation gets about $80. But today it is treated as a Chinese product because the final assembly for this takes place in China. The value addition that China provides to the iPod is $4. But it is treated under the rules as a Chinese product because it is the point of last assembly. And each iPod which is sold in the United States contributes $150 to the trade deficit of the United States with China. That's how trade statistics are calculated. But just to give you an idea about how the manufacturing process has broken down into components, subcomponents, and how all along the supply chain, value chain, and it's now becoming more and more redundant to talk about manufactured in A country or B country. And all these developments basically, and especially the revolution that you're seeing in rising Asia, which is basically East Asia minus Japan, has led to a certain amount of asymmetry in terms of market power. The market power of incumbents in the United States and Europe is going down, and the market power of Asian entities is increasing. And as a result of loss of employment and so on, there is a trend of rising protectionism in the West. Now, let me just go back to the WTO. Previous rounds were supported by Western business interests. It's amazing the kind of partnership that we have in the United States between business and government. The government negotiates on behalf of the business. But this time round, because of the various issues which I have mentioned, the United States business is not very much focused on the Doha round. Now, earlier rounds were sort of pushed and prodded by US business interests and European business interests in search of new markets. They wanted the new round of negotiations to open up new markets. For instance, the Americans wanted the services market. That's why the Uruguay round included the General Agreement on Trade and Services. They wanted intellectual property to be covered. That's why the TRIPS was negotiated and so on. But these issues of market access are no longer as significant as they were in the past because, as I mentioned, this entire paradigm of supply chains and value chains has made many countries liberalize unilaterally. So people are, like India, for instance, most of the reform, most of the liberalization which has taken place in India has taken place unilaterally. And that is the story in many parts of the world. So market access is really literally flowing out of their ears. They don't need a new round of negotiations to force people to open markets. And previous rounds were conducted under US leadership politically. But this time, because of their own domestic crisis, the United States is now looking more and more inward. And the last issue is that unlike in previous rounds, developing countries today are much more organized, much more articulate, and much more together. And they will not allow anything unreasonable to happen, which used to happen in the past. And that is one reason why the American political interests, the business interests have concluded that maybe we can't do business with the WTO anymore. Now, let me just give you a flavor of the changes that are likely to take place in the next few years, just within the next 30, 40 years. This is a study which was conducted for G20 countries. It concluded that the global economy will be 3 times its size, its present size in 2050. And 6 of the largest 7 economies in the world will be developing countries. 6 of the 7. This is a huge change. The United States will be the only developed country in this list of 7 countries. Yeah. Now, at the same time, these developing countries who are rising in their economic levels will remain relatively poor. Because even in 2050, the per capita GDP of China will be 1/3 of the United States. India's will be 11% of the United States. So there will be an issue of relative poverty or relative affluence. And this is bound to create complications in multilateral negotiations. Continuing with that same study, today the developing countries' trade contributes only about 30% to the global trade. In 2050, it will be 70%. So the bulk of global trade flows will be between developing countries. You can imagine what it will do to the balances between developed and developing countries. The other issue is that for development, when you're growing fast, you require more capital. So capital markets will develop more and more in developing countries, but there is always traditionally a lag in terms of development of regulatory capacities. And this will have there will be an imbalance between higher capital needs and weak institutions. And this is probably going to contribute to more frequent financial crises in the world. There will, of course, be the issue of migration. Because as I said, there will continue to be the problem of relative affluence, and there will be demographic problems, especially in Europe, and more people from developing countries will continue to flood these developed countries and the attendant social problems that will be created. And very significantly, there will be a problem of the global commons. The issue of emissions, for instance, which remains unresolved, the fight for minerals resources, the fight for agricultural resources, the fight for the oceans, the fishing, and so on. As a result of all this, the anticipation is that consensus-based multilateral agreements will probably become even more difficult than they are today. Now, all these new challenges require greater cooperation, not less cooperation. And this is the contradiction that we have. The world is getting more complex. The pace of economic change is increasing every year. But the processes of multilateral negotiations are getting more and more bound down in stalemates and impasses and so on. Strong multilateral processes are essential for effective global governances. And therefore, in order to have such strong processes, what you need is a shared vision of the world among all the players. Now, in this kind of a situation where there are conflicts emerging between developed and developing countries, between developing countries themselves, what you need is that shared vision. Now, how is that shared vision going to come? And the point that I am making, and this is central to what I'm saying, is that you cannot continue to expect that leadership to come from developed countries anymore, as it has come for the last 50, 60 years. Now, and increasingly, therefore, there will be pressure on emerging countries like India to contribute to that gap in global leadership. Now, how do you do that? Before I go to what the challenges for India are, let me just give you a small glimpse of the issues in the United States, because the United States is the main issue in many multilateral negotiations. And now, I've talked about their positions in the WTO, but you are all aware of what their positions in the UNFCCC negotiations are. Basically, President Obama, when he went to Copenhagen, he was saying, listen, I'm not going to accept any kind of emission commitments which the US Congress will not legislate. So forget about the United States joining the Kyoto Protocol. Forget about any multilateral emission commitments. We will do what we can do. Now, similarly, in the trade front, till today, President Obama has not made a single speech on trade, except once when he said that he intends to double US exports in 5 years. Exports, not trade. Now, unlike in most countries, the US Congress has a very strong role in decision making, especially on trade issues. The authority to regulate foreign commerce is with the Congress, not with the administration, not with the president. It is the Congress which sometimes delegates that authority to the administration to negotiate. And that authority is called the TPA, the Trade Promotion Authority. Today, the US administration does not have a TPA. So strictly speaking, it is on a very weak footing because it cannot give you binding commitments. What it basically means is that you negotiate with the United States on good faith. If you have a deal, the deal will go to the US Congress, and the US Congress can say, I don't like this clause, remove it. I don't like this comma, make it a full stop, and so on. Whereas, if there is a TPA, the US Congress can only say yes or no. So it's a double whammy, basically. Many countries like India, like China, we believe that negotiating in the absence of a TPA is basically a double whammy, because first you negotiate with the administration, and then you may have to negotiate with the US Congress. So today the United States is really not in a very strong position to negotiate trade deals. And even a number of pretty enlightened folks have been talking about an Indian FTA with the United States. Now let me tell you, when the United States had a TPA, this is just about till 2 years back, they negotiated a number of FTAs with South Korea, with Panama, with Colombia. None of these has yet been approved by US Congress, even though they were negotiated in the presence of a TPA. These three FTAs negotiated under the TPA continue to be in limbo. So, well, this is the broad summary of it. While there are a number of unresolved issues, the major obstacle for a Doha deal is the US position. Now, the United States, because it believes that it cannot do any business with the WTO, is now engaged on a different track. There is the so-called TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is basically a negotiation with 9 countries, or a subset of the APEC members, countries like Singapore, New Zealand, Australia, Chile, Peru, Vietnam, and so on. Now, this is working out a template which is, in their view, a very high standards template, because they're talking about not only issues like labor, environment, etc., they're also talking about harmonization of behind the border regulations. This is a very, very intrusive kind of FTA. And this is what the United States believes is going to be the template for the future. So they are shifting their energy from the multilateral process into a process like this. And the apprehension is that this will only contribute to dividing the world among warring sort of camps, TPPA versus the rest and so on. And similarly, you have the ACTA, which is the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement. A number of countries, I think about 12, 13 countries, are negotiating a strong agreement outside the WTO on enforcement of intellectual property rights. And this again provides a fresh template of how to deal with these things outside the WTO. So these indications basically signify a certain shift of the United States away from the multilateral process. Now, why does a Doha impasse matter? It matters for a number of reasons, but specifically the damage that is being done to the global trading system by the regional deals, the dilution of the non-discrimination principle every day. And don't forget, apart from the trade liberalization, a number of new rules are also being introduced into these FTAs. And these rules, typically, FTAs are involve an asymmetry between the negotiating partners. There are strong countries and weak countries. And a number of weak countries, because of the attraction of FTAs, are being made to accept new rules which will distort the WTO rule system. Then there are a number of issues which cannot be negotiated outside the multilateral process. Issues like, for instance, agricultural reform. How do you negotiate in a non-multilateral way how the developed countries will reduce their agricultural subsidies? How can you negotiate things like food security? For instance, the global volatility of food markets. How do you negotiate on energy security? How do you negotiate on the trade aspects of climate change? So there are a number of issues which can only be negotiated multilaterally, and it is therefore important that the multilateral process is not in any way paralyzed. Now, the issues which I have mentioned are not really balance sheet issues for the companies. They are more systemic issues, and it is therefore important that it is the governments which take the initiative to deal with them, to strengthen the multilateral process, not so much the business constituencies. Now, for whatever it's worth, let me just list out some of the implications for the Doha deal, a possible deal on India. First of all, though developed country tariffs, industrial tariffs are pretty low, on an average they're only about 3 to 4%, but all the high tariffs that they have involve products of developing countries. Things like apparel and clothing, leather, footwear, auto components, things like that. They all have pretty high tariffs. Now, with the new formula that is being worked out, no tariff in industrial countries will be more than 8%. So the tariff peaks will disappear. Similarly, the agricultural subsidy limits that are presently on the bound registers of the WTO will go down drastically, though what it does to actual applied subsidy levels is another story which is still not yet fully negotiated. Now, as I mentioned earlier, on the basis of the present negotiations, India will not be required to reduce its industrial tariffs below whatever it is applied today. It will reduce only its bound levels, not its applied levels. And that is the same story for agriculture. Similarly, on services, whatever is the existing unilateral liberalization, a subset of that will be provided in the GATT's commitments, and nothing new will have to be done in terms of services liberalization by India. And lastly, which is very significant for a country like India, which has underinvested in agriculture, there are no constraints on India to in any way limit agricultural subsidies. Now, as I said earlier, a number of issues of interest to India remain unnegotiated: the SSM, the Mode 4 access and services, fishery subsidies, etc. But the key issue that the United States is insisting on is that beyond whatever we have agreed on industrial subsidies, industrial tariffs reductions, countries like India should compulsorily participate in sectoral negotiations in some sectors of industries to bring down our tariffs to zero or near zero levels. And sectors of their interest are sectors like chemicals or industrial equipment or IT equipment and so on. And all these sectors have huge employment potential in terms of our manufacturing strategies. The cotton issue I mentioned earlier. Now, there are a group of 4 countries, LDCs, least developed countries in Africa, who have been very badly affected by the United States subsidies in terms of market, because the United States subsidies actually reduce global prices, and at those global prices, these countries are not able to market their products. And therefore, it is a major issue which is outstanding, which is that the American cotton subsidies should go down. And if that happens, India, which has witnessed a dramatic increase in cotton productivity over the last 5-7 years, should become a major cotton exporter. Now, why is it important that the Doha deal be done quickly? The United States presidential elections next year, the primaries will be starting. I don't know whether they've already started, but they'll be starting soon. So they'll be engrossed in their process for the next 1.5, 2 years. Similarly, and this is something which is not adequately appreciated, there's going to be a wholesale change in the Chinese leadership next year. Something like 70% of Chinese leadership, including their president, the prime minister, will be changing next year. Now, we've already been on the job for 10 years now. The more you delay, the less credibility the process has. It's important that it is concluded this year, otherwise it'll go off for another 3-4 years, and who knows whether it can be concluded at all. Now, in recent days, there have been some development, some understanding or some realization that this cannot go on forever. And therefore, there is an attempt to try to complete some part of the mandate this year. There is a ministerial meeting in December this year. And there are now ongoing discussions of whether it's possible. Now, people want a minimum package for the least developed countries to be negotiated. This package includes, for instance, issues like duty-free, quota-free access to least developed countries, the issue of cotton, and so on. But here again, the problem is the Americans. But because the moment you were talking about duty-free, quota-free, they again have to go back to their Congress. The moment you talk about cotton subsidies, they have to go back to their Congress, and there is no certainty that the American Congress will agree. And therefore, the Americans are now saying, why should we only pay? We need something to counterbalance what we are giving, and therefore they're demanding other stuff, and whether that is going to be possible or not in terms of fishery subsidies, trade facilitation, and so on, it's not yet clear. Maybe it'll be clear by the end of July. So let me just now come to the conclusions. Can the emerging economies step up to the plate to fill the power vacuum that is emerging? Now, India has been remarkably successful in the last 60 years in the GATT WTO. But if you analyze it critically, Our success has been in our power to say no. We don't want this, we don't want services, we don't want intellectual property right, we don't want the Doha round. I don't know if you know this, in 2001, India was the last country, Mr. Murali Maran, the last person who was literally dragged to the consensus. We don't want a new round, we don't want this. So we've always said no. I think because the world has changed, and because India is perceived to be a major beneficiary of the globalization process, I think the time has come for countries like India to design an agenda which they can take ownership for. What do we want? Do we want to continue to say no, or do we have a positive agenda of our own? And central to that is the issue of China. Whether you like it or not, that's the hidden gorilla in the room. How can we work out a liberalization framework while taking into account the Chinese capabilities? I think these are issues which we need to address domestically. It is important that we limit the damage of RTAs, and the only way to do that is to strengthen the multilateral process and to multilateralize whatever liberalization is taking place in the RTAs. So, to answer Maithili's question, is the Doha round dead? I would say it's perilously close. I had never said that earlier, but I think it's very close to death. But as I explained, we will know by the end of this year whether we can agree to a minimum package for this year. If we cannot even agree to this minimum package, then I would say it's pretty near death. But let me enter one last caveat here. If we are to make progress in the Doha round, in the WTO, I think a major concession for future work that the developed countries will demand is that this amorphous bunch of developing countries, there needs to be a differentiation. China is not Mali or Benin or Burkina Faso. India is not Ethiopia. Can you distinguish between emerging economies like emerging superpowers like Brazil, China, India, who now are developing countries? Can you distinguish them for treatment in the WTO processes from other developing countries? Today there is only one classification, which is LDCs, developing countries. There is nothing in the middle. So I think we will have to eventually wrestle with this particular issue. So what I believe, therefore, the Doha round impasse is only a symptom of the disease. The major problem is that the traditional leaders of the multilateral process, the United States, the EU, now believe that they cannot do business in the WTO because it is too democratic. As long as it was not democratic, it was very easy to implement things and not get things done. But now that the developing countries are so strong in their voice, it's not easy to get the things done from their perspective. Well, I needn't go into this. If we are to design, if we are to get away from our no syndrome and to get a proactive development agenda into the multilateral process like WTO, we need to do a number of things which we've neglected for a long time. For instance, our manufacturing policy. We never had one. Now we have a discussion paper on a new national manufacturing plan. How serious are we for that? And if we are to approve this manufacturing plan, it obviously has certain implications in terms of the tariff protection that some of those industries will require. And therefore, what should be our position in the WTO on those issues? Now, the issue of agricultural reforms I've mentioned earlier. The concern for Indian policymakers has to be that of food security. And for that, you need productivity increases. You need agricultural markets, agricultural land ownership issues to be resolved. You cannot depend on trade. Just to give an example, India produces something like what, about 85 million tons of paddy rice in a year. God forbid there is a shortage of 4 or 5 million tons in 1 year of rice. Can you depend on the global market to import that rice? The global rice market is only about 25 million tons. And normally this market, India is a player as an exporter. Instead of an exporter, if India becomes a major importer of 4 or 5 million tons, there is not that depth in the global food markets to supply continental-sized countries like India and China. So how do you expand productivity? How do you increase your food self-sufficiency? I think these are issues which we need to look at. Innovation, for instance. We don't have a national innovation vision. We are now in the process of trying to evolve some ideas. But for instance, the entire business of generic drugs that we have in India, the largest generic drugs industry in the world, it came out of the policy that we crafted in 1970-71 when we moved away from the product patent regime into process patent regime. And that's how this dramatic increase in the Indian generic drug industry took place. And today, India is seen as the generic drug factory for the rest of the world, especially for the developing world, because the bulk of drugs which go to Africa, for instance, go from India. Now, if we are transiting back into a product patent regime, can our generic drugs continue to, that pipeline, can it continue? So what kind of a policy, IPR policy should we have for these kind of things? For instance, we've never been able to use the kind of flexibilities that have been worked into the TRIPS agreement, like compulsory licensing or production for government, because of our concern that we don't want to disrupt the market and so on. So anyway, let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bhatia. I think that was one of the most lucid treatments of the WTO and the Doha round that I have heard in the past many, many years, I must say. So I think he really deserves a big, big hand. So please join me right now in giving him a big hand, and then I think the floor is open to questions. May I request that you please introduce yourself so that we just, light is a little, can we just have it a little switched off, or the angle changed a little bit because it's really bright into your eyes. Yeah, if you can just introduce yourself. Yep. Thank you so much. If you could just introduce yourself first, because we know where you're coming from, and then address your questions. And as you can see, Mr. Bhatia, the room is full. So I think this really speaks volumes of your expertise in the subject. Yeah, please. The gentleman there at the back. And please keep your questions brief. And if there is time for discussions, you can always open it up for further discussions, because we have half an hour right now.
Yeah, can you, sir, elaborate about this said you have to take the whole issue rather than pick and choose. It's a holistic way of accepting.
Identify yourself.
Dr. Sarabjit Dudeja.
And from where, if you could?
I'm consultant advisor on science and technology.
Okay. Should we take a number of questions? Three, four questions? 2 or 3 questions? Yes, please.
Sir, can you please elaborate about the new market access thing that you talked about, US demanding market?
Okay.
I'm Apoor Srivastava, I'm a student of IIT.
Okay. One more question, and then we can just take the next one. Yes, please.
Sir, my name is Aman Sethi. I recently graduated from law school at Symbiosis, Pune. I have a question to ask you which requires your opinion more than factual data. There is a trend where in the second term of the American presidents, supposing they do get re-elected, we have seen that most of your free trade or your liberalization of the US economy happens in that second term. More specific.
Yes, Mr. Bhatia.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Dudeja, the issue of single undertaking you mentioned, right? The single undertaking basically means that all the issues in the negotiating mandate are treated as one entity, and that a final agreement will involve the approval of all the agreements by all the members. So it means that no country can say, let us say there are 20 agreements in the Uruguay round. No country can say, I accept 16, but I don't accept 4. you have to accept all 20. And the logic for that, there is a certain logic, because in any kind of a negotiation, some people have defensive interest in some areas, offensive interest in some areas. So this single undertaking principle is expected to level out these trade-offs so that everybody can go back home equally dissatisfied.
This is the way to blackmail also.
Well, to put it another way, I think the era for the single undertaking has gone. And the general consensus among those who think about these issues is that the WTO can no longer do business in this way in future rounds. And future negotiation then will be specific to a subset of the members on a subset of issues, rather than a grand overarching single undertaking. So I agree with you. This era is gone. I don't think you will see the single undertaking again after the Doha round. Now, on the issue of new market access, let me just elaborate, Srivastava, what you asked. The issue is this: as I mentioned, in the GATT negotiating process, unlike in the RTAs, what you negotiate is from bound levels. Now, as I said, if my industrial tariffs are 35%, I'm negotiating from that. Are they bound in the WTO at 35%? Then I'm negotiating from that platform. And I will say, okay, I will give you a 50% reduction or a 60% reduction. Now, I do not negotiate from applied tariffs because that's my home domain. It's my wish how much I reduce at a particular point in time, but I have the option to take it back to the bound level at any time. So this is how GATT negotiations, WTO negotiations have always been conducted, on the basis of bound tariffs. What the Americans are saying, we're not getting any meat in this, because you've already liberalized this much. The whole world is already getting this liberalization. What is the new stuff that you're giving to us? Our Congress, our businessmen are not going to be, our Congress is not going to approve a deal where we don't get new business access, which means go below your applied levels. Now, you see, the WTO negotiators are not very famous for their consistency, because it is the same Americans who are talking, when it comes to agricultural subsidies, they are saying, we will negotiate on the basis of our present bound levels of subsidies, not on applied levels of subsidies. So there you have it. On this issue, Aman, of second term syndrome, I agree. Any American president in his second term is less fettered to the political process. And therefore, he is expected to exercise more leadership, international leadership. But there is a problem here. The problem is this. Now, as I mentioned, the President Bush in his second term had the TPA. And in his second term, he was very adventurous. He negotiated the South Korean FTA, negotiated the Panama FTA, negotiated the Colombia FTA. But he couldn't get it through the Congress because the time had run out. So there is no guarantee. Now, and there is a new element which is coming into the United States economy. I think it would require a very bold economist to say that the American economy after 3 years will be strong and robust enough for it to be able to change the mood in America, change the mood in the Congress, so that they can accept the Doha deal at that time and not today. So there is really no guarantee of the future. And I don't think we should pin our hopes on that.
Any more questions? Yes. Yeah, please. No, please go ahead.
Do I need a mic or so?
No, you are quite audible.
I'm Pradeep Bhatia. I was international. I have a business, international business in trade, and now I've retired. The question, I mean, it's more of a. What I'd like to ask, Sojal Bhatia, is that to me, what I've understood, multilateralism looks pretty dead at the moment. This. So, is attitude to regional trade agreement necessarily a bad thing? I mean, is it? Because isn't it the practical way out? Because the way the US is operating, quite obviously it looks like a, it looks like almost a big stalemate. And it's going to remain like that because US policy is very much, dependent on the present political climate in the US and the present economic situation. So should we not, look after ourselves by going through this favorable regional trade agreements with each other, with China, etc., etc.
I'm Mr. Srivastava, a retired member of the CBEC. My question is more or less the same. What did your views? As you said, practically Doha round is dead. In the event that it doesn't successfully conclude, even on the some of the limited issues that you mentioned, do you think that the RTAs and FTAs will be taking their place? And if so, how they'll be able to fill this void? I would like to have you.
Yeah, we can take one more question, I think.
I must also compliment you for giving a very, very informative, as she said, Mathili lucid, and I'll say more enlightened talk on the subject which is today in the news around. Thank you very much.
Yeah, one more question, then we can again take some
K.
more.
Manish, I'm Additional Commissioner of Trade and Taxes. You talked about the dispute settlement mechanism.
Sorry?
You talked about
DSP.
the dispute
Yeah.
settlement mechanism in WTO. It's the jewel in the crown of the WTO. Which other kind of settlements do you think, why it is that it's a jewel in the crown? Is it what it was designed, or it is really true? And number two, if the Doha round becomes dead, and what is the future of the WTO?
Future of the WTO. Now, on this issue of RTAs, there are certain purists like Jagdish Bhagwati who call this endlessly proliferating RTAs sort of a spaghetti bowl or whatever, that they are adding much complexity to the global trading system. And I don't need to convince Mr. Srivastava of this as a customs man, of the kind of problems that a customs officer has when he's dealing with imports, as to what kind of duty is leviable on the particular commodity depending on the origin of that. It is adding a lot of complexity to the global trading system. So that is one side of the story. The other side of the story is that, as I said, most RTAs have a certain issue of imbalance, because it is between powerful countries and not so powerful countries. And because of the lack of balance in the negotiating power, the kind of rules which are being built into the RTAs are actually very, very distorting. For instance, as I said, the TRIPS agreement was a very, very hardly contested agreement. It is still a very, very controversial agreement, and many people, including in India, believe that we should never have such an agreement in the WTO acquis. Now, but what the RTAs are doing is removing the flexibilities that the developing countries have in the TRIPS agreement and making them agree to even more stringent norms. For instance, I don't know if some of you have followed the negotiations between India and EU on the FTA, which is still incomplete. A number of bodies in India have cautioned against India compromising on the IPR side. So India is strong enough to resist these pressures, I hope. But many smaller countries are not that strong. And therefore, the more RTAs proliferate, the more distortive rules get put into the global system, and they become a sort of a standard. Now, that is the negative side of the RTAs. Let me go to the positives. And I think it's a very practical businessman's approach. If the multilateral process is dead or not delivering, can I wait indefinitely? Should the business not go on? Should liberalization not go on regardless? And that is the logic of RTAs. And therefore, you cannot say that RTAs should be banned. RTAs will take place, whether you like it or not. But the point is, at some point in time, the liberalization that you undertake in RTAs needs to be multilateralized and needs to be built into the global system, which is the WTO system. And that is why you need, I've been writing about these issues on a number of occasions, and what I'm saying is that you need to develop a new complementarity between RTAs and the multilateral system, where the multilateral system absorbs this liberalization which is taking place in RTAs and enshrines it into global rules, so that you have a greater system of predictability in the global trading system. That is about the RTAs. Now about the, Mahesh, about the DSM, jewel in the crown. Let me give you one example, and I hope that illustrates the point that you're making. There is a small West Indies country, two countries actually, Antigua and Barbuda, not Barbados, Barbuda. Now, these are the two countries which were involved in a dispute with the United States. Now, these are handkerchief-sized countries. Some of them, for instance, I had never heard of Barbuda myself, but they were engrossed in a major dispute with the United States. And this dispute, every dispute in the world has some Indians behind it.
And if it's legal, it's usually a carrier.
This dispute was about internet gambling. The United States have some very peculiar rules. You can go to a racetrack and gamble about horses. You can go to a casino and gamble your fortune away. But you can't indulge in internet gambling. These are the rules. Now, what these guys were doing was that there was a company in the United Kingdom. It's a very colorful story, actually. The main promoter was a lady porn star, but the IT programs were written by Indian IIT graduates, and it was a very, very successful company. And what they did was to base themselves in Antigua, Barbuda, but they were catering to the U.S. market. And most of the gamblers were Americans. Now the Americans were enraged. They said, you are bypassing our domestic laws. So there was a lot of hue and cry. And you know, how do you stop an offshore entity from doing business? Most of these transactions, well, not most, all of these transactions actually result in credit card transactions. So they issued instructions to the credit card companies not to honor these kind of deals, and therefore the business went pat. The Antigua and Barbuda went to the WTO dispute mechanism, and they won their case in the panel. The Americans appealed to the appellate body. The appellate body upheld the panel decision. The Americans would not implement, so the Antigua and Barbuda asked for a compliance panel. And so it goes. It's not yet been complied with, but there are now many strong voices in the United States which say that how can we be...
You just don't comply, what do you do?
Yeah, I'm coming to that. But no, my next few sentences should answer that question. America is the strongest country in the world, but it still feels the heat of non-compliance. And therefore, there are a number of strong people in the Congress, including the former chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Barney Frank, who are saying this is ridiculous. We need to change our laws. And they will eventually have to change their law to make internet gambling legal. And now in the meantime, the Indians who were there, the IIT guys, they were wanted. There was a red corner alert for them, and now they have sort of done a deal with the United States, and they've bought immunity. So the issue is not fully settled, but it is in the process of being settled. The other issue, to answer your second question, the issue of zeroing, which I referred to in anti-dumping investigation. The Americans are in gross violation, and they are in non-compliance. But the recent developments in the last few months demonstrate that the Americans are now quietly trying to change their investigation practices to do away with this practice of zeroing. So the point I'm making, Mahesh, is this, that the dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO, by its independence, by its impartiality, by the quality of its judgments, has been able to command the credibility of the world. Now, that doesn't mean that it has no problems. There are several problems. For instance, the access that small countries have to the dispute mechanism. It's a very, very expensive business. A normal case, it costs about $3 to $4 million. Now, India does it differently. Whenever we have a dispute, we take our own people, lawyers, and we do it in about 30, 40 lakhs. But it does cost a lot of money to those small countries who do not have the legal expertise with them. So there are a number of reforms which are being envisaged. But broadly, I would say that it continues to be a very, very sound mechanism. Now, the future of the WTO, and this is an issue which I've been preoccupied with for a long time, and I've been writing about this. And there are a number of very influential people in the United States and Europe who have been saying the Doha round is a drag on the WTO. Abandon the round and allow the WTO to continue with its business. And what I'm saying is, it's not the Doha round which is the problem. The problem is in the WTO. Because if the main promoters of this organization, the United States, Europeans, have turned their back away from this, there's no way you can continue to do business in the WTO. So you have to find a new paradigm of cooperation. So it's not about the Doha round, it's about the WTO and our ability between developed and developing countries to sit together and work constructively to find cooperative solutions to global challenges.
Yeah, I think there was a question at the back.
Sir, I'm Rajan Ratna, I'm working in PGA. I have basically two or three of your views. One you said, and I have been hearing about some early harvest which is to come. Now, if that early harvest has to come, how do you feel? Will it be as you have presented that it will be compartmentalized, that means only a few issues?
I can ask if, I don't want to hog the question.
No, that's okay. I think we have.
Somebody else wants to ask it, so.
Any more questions? Otherwise, we'll come back to Pradeep. Yeah, I'll just start. Okay, sure. Since we have time. Yeah, sure. Just make it brief, that's all.
My name is Subhash Verma. I'm Chief Executive of Cameo Communications, Cameo Image that is. My observation is treating countries as businesses rather than family members of the globe. Now, if you treat them as a business entity, then the amount of what you give and what you get, you account for. But you live as a family member, then that is an issue. I mean, you give as much as you can without expecting much to come in. That's one issue. That's what because finally what happens in a family, it doesn't get better than what we actually allow it to become. That's how it operates. That's one observation. It may be utopian, but that's what I feel it is. Second is, capability clause is probably above all flaws. If I'm capable, I can really arm twist and wrest out anything that I want from you. And you can't do a damn to me. Now, if that is the attitude, then these things fail, just like they don't have enough teeth. UN suffers from this. We have lots of laws, yet it doesn't work out. We still fight. Agreements don't work. If there is something you can suggest on this, because you have been working on it, thank you.
You, I think.
Yeah, this thing. See, what came out of this and what most Indians believe is that US definitely is a culprit in this. But if you read Western literature, they often told India is a culprit. And I think we are somewhat to blame because we have our internal problems which have contributed to the fact that we have not been able to achieve. We could have met with some of the conditions which the West wants, and those are because of our own rigidities, particularly in manufacturing and agriculture. Had we been, had we pulled through the reform process which started in the 90s with Narasimha Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh, had we gone through that, and then we would have been 20 years ahead, and we would have been in a much better position to either, one, to negotiate with the WTO, and secondly, we would have been in a much better position to be able to accept many of the things which the US wants to impose on us, or the WTO wants to impose on us collectively, whatever.
If I may, Mr. Bhatia, just add, because just two questions as a chair, let me also ask just two questions. One is, I was a little surprised you said 80% of the Doha rounds agenda is done. I would have thought that except for trips, particularly with drugs, that has been the one significant achievement really. But I would have thought maybe the balances maybe, almost only about 60% done and 40 or 50% left undone. So a little intrigued by how you say 80%. And my second question was, you said, that FTAs and bilaterals, the complementarity can be integrated, but I thought precisely because each FTA is different, what you settle depends on the strengths of the two different trade partners. Is there really a complementarity between bilaterals and multilaterals? With that, any more questions? I think with these we can just wind up because we have 5 minutes left. Any last questions?
Yes.
Okay, just
One more.
one last.
So you talked about the WTO being a much more democratic body because of one country, one vote. It's not voting what you have in the IMF and the World Bank. But you find still IMF and the World Bank being a continuing success, you may correct me. But why this WTO with having one vote, one country, having one, so why consensus is not being informed?
Thanks. Now, I will answer Mahesh, your question about why the consensus is not being evolved, linked to what Rajan was asking about early harvest. Now, presently, because of the pressures which are being built up on the WTO in terms of its credibility, people generally believe, the members believe that something has to be done this year. Now, what is that something? So they have now started discussing about the so-called early harvest. Now, what is this early harvest? First of all, it's very ironical that after 10 years you talk about an early harvest. But nevertheless, some people believe, and this is the view of India and other countries like Brazil and China and so on, the early harvest should be only LDC modalities, basically issues involving LDCs. Now, there are a number of such issues. For instance, as I mentioned, the duty-free, quota-free, the cotton issue, a services waiver for LDCs, and so on. Now, and this question also relates to what Subhash was asking about. Can you do this as a business enterprise or as a family? Nothing is done in a utopian or a philanthropic way in the WTO. The ethos of WTO is the ethos of the GATT, which is of pure mercantilism. You can't get anything for free. So even when you make a demand, you nuance the demand by saying, I want you to give me this, but at the same time, I'm not a demandor. Now, because a demandor is a person who has to pay something for that concession. So I will say, you do this, but don't ask me to do something in return. But that is the spirit of GATT. That is the spirit of the WTO. It's about rupiah ana paisa. You are giving me a concession, I'm going to benefit by this much, what am I going to give to you? This, unfortunately, is the nature of the beast, there's nothing you can do about it. Now, how does this relate to the early harvest? In the early harvest, it is only the United States which is sweating. because it is only the United States which has difficult issues like cotton and duty-free, quota-free to contend with. Nobody else is sweating. For instance, India has already implemented the LDC, duty-free, quota-free. So the Americans are therefore saying, what kind of a deal is this where only we pay the price and everybody else goes scot-free? So they are demanding some countervailing concessions from the others. Okay, if you want me to do this, then before I take it to Congress, you will have to add something from the other side of issues of interest to our businesses, our Congress, and so on. And this is where the complexities of the negotiation start now. This is what is being negotiated now. Now, whether we will have a deal, and I suspect the political pressure on the WTO is so much that eventually the chances of a early harvest deal are good by the end of this year. Now, I would say that it would be an LDC package, but the cotton issue will not be resolved because the cotton issue is central to the kind of political lobbying that takes place in the United States Congress. The millions of dollars that the cotton interests provide to the Congress guys for their elections. There's no way they will agree to an interim cotton deal. So what they will do is, in fact, Lamy has been also very clever in saying a step ahead in cotton. He's not saying a deal in cotton, a step ahead. What is that step ahead? How can you have a credible assurance of a resolution of this problem for the future, and yet people will believe that something has happened? So that's the real trick of the negotiations, how we can do this. But at the end of the day, the United States will demand other countries to do something. Now, what is that something? Now, something which I believe should be done, it should not be a subject matter of give and take or trade-offs, is something which is dear to Mr. Srivastava's mind, which is trade facilitation, which is basically improvement of customs procedures for imports and exports in all countries. Nobody should object to that. Nobody should use this as a bargaining chip. I suspect the trade facilitation agreement is something which can be agreed to in the early harvest. Now, the other issues like the environmental goods, again, I think the Americans will insist on this. They may insist on fishery subsidies, and you may have some sort of settlement. So at the end of the day, it has to be sort of a trade-off between what the Americans need to provide and what others need to provide. Now, you asked about consensus -1. Now, these are good ideas, fancy ideas, and they are born out of frustration. But you cannot have a deal in a multilateral body like the WTO without the Americans. No way. So I think these are only ideas which arise from frustration. They cannot be implemented in today's world. Now, Subhashu talked about utopian views. I think they are utopian. The WTO is a very hard place. Nobody gives anything for free. That's the way business is done. And whether it is the WTO, whether it is the climate change negotiations, it's all about hard national interest that people talk about. Unfortunately, and this is the point I was trying to make, that these challenges are not national challenges, they are global challenges. The issue of climate change is a global challenge. Now, you have to have cooperative solutions. You have to work like a family. But you see no symptoms of that happening anytime soon. Now, about domestic reforms, I could not agree more. I could not agree more to that at all. Because, for 6 years, I've been talking about the poor Indian farmer. And every time I said the poor Indian farmer, I was blaming the bad Indian agricultural expert who is preventing the agricultural development of the country. It is our domestic problem that we are unable to resolve the agricultural conundrum.
And even legitimately manufacturing policy, labor policy.
Things like that. Now, the issue, when you talk about manufacturing, the issue is basically you're asking yourself, how can I compete with China? Not with the United States, not with Europe, with China. And how can you do that without a coherent policy on labor reform, for instance? And these are issues which we have been sidestepping for years. I don't know whether the national manufacturing plan, which is being under...
Because I've been in industry with.
Now, about this 80%, 60%, let me put it this way. As I said, bulk of the technical negotiations are complete. There are only one or two areas like the SSM, fishery subsidies, etc., where technical negotiations need to take place to develop the draft agreement. What is this 20% largely is the political will. For instance, the sectorals that the Americans are demanding, in the mandate, it's very clear the mandate is voluntary participation in sectorals. What the Americans are saying, it's voluntary except for India, Brazil, China. So basically, dhakkeshai. But if you want a deal, and frankly, if you look at it critically, if your average tariffs are, say, 8-9% today, and if you have a national policy of reducing them further, do you have a problem of binding these tariffs reforms in the WTO? So I think we need to think a little positively, and I agree with what Pradeep said. If we advance our domestic reforms enough, and if we have a clear national vision of what our tariff structure should be in the next 10 years, I see very little difficulty in taking these reforms into the binding process. Now, if people are saying, okay, you reduce your tariffs in chemicals to say 0 or 1%, they don't mean that you reduce all tariff lines to 0-1. If you have sensitivities, you can always exclude them in the negative list. So it's a question of having an actual negotiation rather than an ideological dialogue. So I think it's possible, but I go back to this family thing. I think it's important that we recognize, all of us, all countries in the world, that we're in this together. It's not a question of defending national narrow interests anymore. It's a question about sustainability of the global economic system. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bhatia. I think with that we come to the conclusion of this very interesting discussion. I think the WTO reflects all the problems of democracy at work, like India. You know, when you have one person, one vote, you have to carry everybody along with you, as we've realized. I think the WTO suffers, quote unquote, suffers is not the right word, but that's how it seems to be. So I think we have to hope, if we have hope in India, we have hope in the WTO mechanism too. Thank you so much, Mr. Bhatia. It's really been a pleasure listening to you. And thank you all for being so